He broke the story of his own death, hours before it happened. Welcome to Marple Casebook. I am your host, Selwyn. Let's piece this mystery together. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Your thoughts always add intrigue to the case. Let's begin. The small village of St. Mary Mead rarely made the news, except in the local gazette when the Women's Institute held a particularly successful fundraiser. But on this particular morning, the entire village was abuzz with something far more unusual. A death notice in the Times announcing the passing of a man who was very much alive the evening before. Geoffrey Ransom, a London-based journalist known for his sharp wit and incisive investigative pieces, had reportedly died in his countryside retreat, a modest cottage just outside the village. His name appeared in the obituaries, the notice brief and devoid of sentiment. Geoffrey Ransom, aged 42, passed away at his residence in St. Mary Mead on the 14th of March. Funeral arrangements private. Miss Marple, who had been enjoying her morning tea and toast, read the notice twice. It was not the sort of thing one expected to find, particularly about someone who had greeted her just yesterday as he walked down the lane. She frowned and set down her cup. Something was decidedly odd. By noon, the entire village had gathered near Ransom's cottage. His housekeeper, Mrs. Felton, was in a state of distress, claiming she had found the door locked from the inside that morning with no response from within. The local constable, young and eager but somewhat out of his depth, had been called. After much debate, they forced the door open. Inside, Geoffrey Ransom lay sprawled across his desk, face down over a manuscript, a heavy, half-finished sentence frozen on the page beneath him. A glass, toppled on its side, had spilled dark liquid across the desk. The acrid scent of whiskey and something more pungent lingered in the air. It looked, at first glance, like poison. Dr. Haydock was summoned, his brows furrowed as he examined the body. He's been dead for hours. Sometime in the night, I'd say. But this notice... He gestured toward the folded newspaper someone had brought along, the very one announcing Ransom's death before it had even occurred. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the back of the room, took in every detail: the overturned glass, the position of the body, the neatness of the room, too neat, as though it had been arranged that way. She glanced at the unfinished manuscript. Geoffrey Ransom had been a journalist with a reputation for uncovering corruption. He had made enemies. But who would go to the trouble of publishing his death notice in advance? And how had the murderer locked the door from the inside? Miss Marple, with the quiet patience of a seasoned observer, watched the scene unfold as the constable moved through the formalities. He questioned Mrs. Felton first, the housekeeper dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, though her distress seemed more from the shock of discovery than grief. I don't understand it," she said, voice trembling. "Mr. Ransom was in fine spirits yesterday evening. He had supper as usual, then went to his study to write. I left him there, locked up the house, and retired. When I came down this morning, the door to the study was locked, and he didn't answer." The constable frowned. "Are you certain it was locked?" Mrs. Felton gave a helpless nod. "I tried the handle myself, and the windows, they were all latched from the inside. I had to fetch Mr. Phelps from the bakery to help break in." Miss Marple glanced at the window in question. The latch was, indeed, still in place. The key to the door lay on the desk near Ransom's outstretched hand, as if it had been dropped there after the fact. A classic locked-room mystery, but she had seen too many supposedly impossible crimes to be fooled by appearances. The constable turned his attention to the doctor. "Poison, you think?" Dr. Haydock, ever the pragmatist, gave a non-committal grunt. "Could be. The whiskey's got a strange smell to it. Won't know for certain until we run tests, but if he was poisoned, we'll have to consider how it was administered." Miss Marple, meanwhile, was looking at the desk. A few pages of a typewritten manuscript were neatly stacked, but the last page, where Ransom's hand had come to rest, had a faint smudge near the top. Ink? No, something else. She leaned in ever so slightly and caught a faint metallic tang in the air. Then she noticed something odd. A small ceramic figurine sat near the inkwell. A delicate thing, depicting a fox curled into itself, tail wrapped around its body. Its placement seemed deliberate, and yet out of place. She had been in this house before, briefly, and she was quite sure she had seen this particular ornament in the sitting room. Why had it been moved? Miss Marple's gaze lifted, studying the room's occupants. Mrs. Felton was still wringing her hands. The constable was dutifully jotting notes. Dr. Haydock adjusted his glasses and examined the whiskey bottle. And then there was Mr. Phelps, the baker who had helped break the door down. He stood near the door, shifting uneasily, as though he would rather be anywhere else. A nervous man, but that in itself meant nothing. People reacted differently to death. But when his gaze landed on the ceramic fox, his expression flickered, just for a moment. A tiny hesitation, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. Miss Marple smiled to herself. She had seen something now, something no one else had noticed, and she rather thought it would be useful indeed. "Would you like me to continue?" Miss Marple remained by the desk, her eyes drifting over the room with quiet interest, while the constable began his questioning. She had learned long ago that people often revealed the most when they were least aware of being watched. Mrs. Felton, still visibly shaken, sat clutching her handkerchief. "I told you, sir. I last saw Mr. Ransom after supper. He was in good spirits." "You said you locked up," the constable prompted. "Did you hear anything in the night? A sound, perhaps?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Well, I did think I heard him moving about past midnight, but that wasn't unusual. He often stayed up late writing." "Did he have any visitors yesterday?" Mrs. Felton fidgeted. "No one that I saw, but then he often had letters, and sometimes he received telegrams." Miss Marple caught the way her hands twisted at her apron. A small but telling sign. She wasn't lying, precisely, but she wasn't telling everything either. The constable nodded and turned to Mr. Phelps. The baker, who had been standing stiffly near the door, cleared his throat. "I was just passing by this morning when Mrs. Felton called me. She was in a panic, knocking on the study door. When it didn't open, I helped force it. That's all I know." Miss Marple studied him, the way his fingers tapped absently against his palm. She had seen his reaction to the ceramic fox, but now she wondered something else. Why had he been passing by so early? "Mr. Phelps," she said gently, "were you delivering bread to the house this morning?" The baker blinked at her. "What? Oh, no. Mr. Ransom wasn't one of my regulars. I was just on my way to the shop." "At 7:30?" There was the tiniest pause. Not long enough for the constable to notice, but long enough for Miss Marple. "I like to start early," Phelps said with an awkward chuckle. Miss Marple gave him a pleasant smile, but she noted the way he shifted on his feet, the way his eyes flickered toward the study door as if weighing something. The constable, oblivious to this, was already turning toward Dr. Haydock. "Doctor, I'll need to note your observations." Dr. Haydock gave a heavy sigh. "Well, as I said, he's been dead for hours. But I can tell you this much. The poison, if it was poison, must have acted slowly. He had time to write before he died. That unfinished sentence on the manuscript might tell us something." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the desk again. The last sentence was cut off mid-thought, and so the truth is finally out. A dramatic phrase, and one that suggested Ransom had been about to expose something. She wondered what he had discovered before he was silenced. The constable closed his notebook and sighed. It seemed simple enough. Poisoned whiskey, locked room, no forced entry. If he drank alone, the question is who gave him the poison. Miss Marple made a thoughtful sound. "Or perhaps," she said mildly, The real question is, who wanted us to believe he drank alone? The constable frowned, but before he could reply, the front door opened and a new voice entered the conversation. I demand to know what's going on. A woman swept into the room, tall, elegant, and dressed with the careful, effortless style of someone accustomed to being noticed. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, lingering on Ransom's body before she pressed a gloved hand to her lips. "Oh, Geoffrey," she murmured. "So it's true?" Miss Marple observed the woman's entrance with great interest. She recognized her at once. Vivian Harcourt, a London socialite who had, by all accounts, once been very close to Geoffrey Ransom. The constable straightened. "And you are, madam?" Vivian's eyes, still fixed on Ransom, did not waver. "I am his fiancée." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Even Mrs. Felton, who had been steadfastly wringing her hands, looked startled. "I wasn't aware Mr. Ransom was engaged," the constable said. Vivian turned her gaze to him, lifting a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Well, I suppose he hadn't made it public yet, but he intended to. He proposed just last week." Miss Marple noted the way she said it. Smoothly, effortlessly. And yet there was something a touch too rehearsed in the delivery, as though she had prepared the line in advance. The constable cleared his throat. "And when did you last see Mr. Ransom?" "Yesterday afternoon." Vivian sighed, removing one glove. "I came down from London. We had tea at the Rose and Crown, then I returned to my hotel in the evening." "And he was well when you left?" "Of course." She folded her arms, studying the constable with faint impatience. "I assume you suspect foul play." The constable hesitated. "We're treating the matter seriously, madam." Vivian let out a short laugh. "How very diplomatic of you. Well, let me save you some trouble. I can tell you exactly who killed him." Every head turned toward her. Even Dr. Haydock, who had been inspecting the whiskey bottle, looked up in interest. Miss Marple, however, merely watched, waiting. Vivian tilted her chin. He was being blackmailed. There was a stunned silence. Then the constable asked, "By whom?" Vivian's lips curled slightly. "I don't know the name, but I know what it was about. He had been working on a story, something big. He hinted at it, but never gave me details. And then, 2 nights ago, he told me someone was trying to stop him from publishing." Miss Marple's hands folded neatly over the handle of her purse. Vivian's voice dropped to a dramatic whisper. "He said if anything happened to him, I should tell the police." There was a breathless pause. Then Miss Marple spoke, her voice as gentle as ever. "How curious," she said, "that he told you all this, yet never mentioned you to anyone here." Vivian turned sharply. "What?" Miss Marple smiled. "You claim he proposed last week, yet his housekeeper seemed quite unaware of it. Mr. Ransom was not an especially secretive man. Why would he keep something so important hidden?" Vivian hesitated for the first time. "Perhaps he wanted to make the announcement himself." Miss Marple nodded, as if considering this. "Yes, perhaps. Or perhaps he never intended to." There was a charged silence. The constable, slow to catch on, but sensing something amiss, cleared his throat. "Miss Harcourt, where exactly did you stay last night?" Vivian's eyes flickered, just for a second. "At the King's Arms in Much Benham." Miss Marple smiled again. "Ah, then I suppose someone will be able to confirm that." Vivian's hand clenched slightly around her glove. Miss Marple did not press further. She had seen what she needed, and she rather thought that Vivian Harcourt had just told her first lie. Miss Marple watched as Vivian Harcourt adjusted her gloves with a practiced air of control. A beautiful woman, striking in her poise, but Miss Marple had encountered such types before. Women who were accustomed to commanding attention, who played at vulnerability when it suited them. But it was the hesitation, the brief flicker of uncertainty in her expression when asked about her whereabouts that truly intrigued her. The constable, now on alert, jotted something in his notebook before turning back to Mrs. Felton. "You never saw Miss Harcourt yesterday?" Mrs. Felton, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet during the exchange, gave a quick shake of her head. "No, sir. I had no idea Mr. Ransom was engaged to anyone." Miss Marple noted the way she spoke. Too firm, too quick. A careful listener would hear not just surprise, but something closer to resentment. Mrs. Felton had worked for Geoffrey Ransom for years. If she had disapproved of this supposed engagement, would she have kept it to herself? Vivian let out a sharp laugh. "Well, he certainly intended to tell people. Perhaps he was waiting for the right moment." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, her tone unreadable. The constable tapped his notebook. "You claim Mr. Ransom was being blackmailed. Do you have any idea what about?" Vivian hesitated, her gaze flickering over the assembled faces. "No," she admitted. "But I do know he was nervous. He was on to something, and he believed someone was trying to stop him." Miss Marple saw the reaction this produced. Dr. Haydock frowned deeply. Mrs. Felton tightened her grip on her handkerchief, and Mr. Phelps, the baker, shifted his weight slightly, as though restless to be somewhere else. Vivian continued, her voice measured. He had enemies. Geoffrey made his career exposing corruption. People in power feared him. That much was true, Miss Marple knew. Geoffrey Ransom had built a reputation for uncovering scandals, but he had never been reckless. He was careful, meticulous. If he had truly uncovered something dangerous, it would have been with a journalist's caution. The constable straightened. "Miss Harcourt, I will need to confirm your whereabouts last night. You say you stayed at the King's Arms in Much Benham." Vivian's gaze did not waver. "Yes, you're welcome to check." "And you didn't leave after returning to the hotel?" A beat of silence. "No," she said smoothly. Miss Marple caught the tiniest flicker in her expression. Too controlled, too measured. She had expected the question. The constable turned to Mrs. Felton. "Was there any trouble between Mr. Ransom and anyone recently?" Mrs. Felton hesitated, her lips pressing together. "No, sir, but—" She faltered, eyes darting toward the desk. "But—" "There was a letter," she admitted. "It arrived 2 days ago. He seemed troubled by it." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. "What kind of letter?" "I don't know, ma'am. He read it in his study and then he burned it." Vivian let out a soft exhale. That must have been the blackmail demand. "Or," Miss Marple said mildly, "something else entirely." Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly inspecting the whiskey glass, suddenly spoke up. "This drink, if he was poisoned, I'll wager it wasn't in the whiskey itself. The scent is too strong. If you wanted to kill a man unnoticed, you wouldn't use something that leaves such a trace." Miss Marple gave him an approving nod. "Quite so, Doctor." The constable frowned. "Then how was it administered?" Miss Marple let her gaze drift to the desk. The unfinished manuscript, the fox figurine, the neat arrangement of papers. A staged scene. She turned back to Mrs. Felton. "Tell me, dear, when you set Mr. Ransom's supper last night, was there anything unusual about it?" The housekeeper hesitated. "No, ma'am. Just as usual, cold ham, a bit of bread, and his tea." The room fell silent for a moment. Dr. Haydock straightened. Tea. That would make more sense. A slow-acting poison, something that wouldn't take effect immediately. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. She had suspected it the moment she noticed the arrangement of the desk. The whiskey glass had been placed deliberately to mislead them, but if poison had been in the tea, then it had been given to him by someone who had access to the household. Vivian's lips pursed. "Surely you aren't suggesting Mrs. Felton poisoned him?" Mrs. Felton let out a soft gasp. "I did no such thing." "I'm merely suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that whoever poisoned him wished to misdirect us." The constable looked at her thoughtfully. "Are you saying this was made to look like suicide?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but there is something else. The death notice. Vivian frowned. What about it? Miss Marple clasped her hands. Someone took great care to place that notice before he died, almost as if they wanted us to believe his death was inevitable. Vivian narrowed her eyes. And who would do that? Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the ceramic fox. I rather think, she murmured, that the answer is hidden in the details. There was a silence in the room, each person considering the weight of her words, and as she looked at the faces before her, she knew that someone in this very room had a secret they were desperate to keep. The constable straightened, clearly sensing that the case was on the verge of breaking open. His eyes darted between Miss Marple and the assembled suspects. Are you saying, he said slowly, that this was a planned murder? That someone went to the trouble of setting up his death to look like suicide? Miss Marple inclined her head. Oh yes, quite so. A careful hand was at work here. Vivian Harcourt let out a soft scoff. Well, if that's true, then surely the answer is simple. Whoever poisoned him must have had access to his tea, and that means someone in this house. Mrs. Felton, still clutching her handkerchief, let out a small gasp. I had nothing to do with it, I swear. The constable turned back to her. And yet you were the one who prepared his supper. Yes, but I only ever made things the way he liked them. I set the tray in the study before I retired for the night. I never touched his tea after that. Miss Marple watched the woman closely. There was real fear in her eyes, and yet not the kind of fear one would expect from a guilty party. No, this was the fear of someone who knew too much but was afraid to speak. The constable frowned, flipping back through his notebook. We have a locked room, an apparent poisoning, and a published death notice in the paper before the murder even happened. And now we have a poisoned cup of tea. He let out a huff. That's enough for me to bring someone in. Vivian's lips curled slightly. Then I suppose we all know who that should be. Miss Marple noted how quickly she had seized on the opportunity to direct suspicion elsewhere. But before she could say anything, there was a sudden knock at the front door. Constable Barlow glanced at his sergeant before moving toward the entrance. When he returned, he held a telegram in his hands. Just arrived, sir. Urgent. The senior officer took it, ripped it open, and scanned the contents. His eyes widened. Well, that settles it. What is it? Dr. Haydock asked. The constable lifted his gaze. The forensic report from the laboratory. The tea in Mr. Ransom's cup contained digitalis, a powerful heart stimulant, lethal in the right dose. A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Felton went pale. Oh, dear Lord. The constable's expression hardened. Mrs. Felton, you were the last person to prepare Mr. Ransom's tea. You had the opportunity to poison him. The housekeeper's breath came in shallow gasps. No, I swear. Why would I harm him? He was always kind to me. But you were loyal, weren't you? Vivian interjected smoothly, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You must have known something about his affairs. Did you see something you shouldn't have? Did he threaten to dismiss you? Tears welled in Mrs. Felton's eyes. No, never. He trusted me. The constable sighed. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you had the means and the opportunity. I'm afraid I have no choice. Miss Marple watched in silence as he gestured for his sergeant to step forward. The younger man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, before reaching for Mrs. Felton's arm. Come along now. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes remained fixed on Mrs. Felton's face, searching. She was an honest woman, that much was clear, and yet someone had gone to great lengths to make it appear otherwise. As Mrs. Felton was led away, Vivian exhaled, a slight smirk of satisfaction flickering at the corners of her lips. Dr. Haydock crossed his arms, looking distinctly troubled. Mr. Phelps, the baker, shifted awkwardly near the door. Well, Vivian said lightly, I suppose that's the end of that. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, my dear, I very much doubt it. Vivian frowned. What? Miss Marple turned to the constable. You must feel quite relieved to have the matter solved so quickly." The constable, caught off guard by her tone, hesitated. "It's a clear case. Poisoned tea. Who else could have done it?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Indeed. But tell me, have you asked yourself why Mr. Ransom would continue to drink his tea if he noticed something amiss?" The constable frowned. "What do you mean?" "The poison used, digitalis, does not act instantly. It has a bitter taste. Mr. Ransom was a cautious man, a journalist by trade. If he noticed his tea tasted different, would he have continued drinking it?" A pause. Vivian's fingers curled slightly against her gloves. Miss Marple smiled. "It would be quite different if, say, the poison had been administered in something he could not taste, something he trusted implicitly." Dr. Haydock let out a quiet exhale. "His medication." The room went silent. Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. Mr. Ransom suffered from heart trouble, did he not? He was taking regular doses of digitalis already, but a slightly higher dose, undetectable in his medicine bottle, would have been enough to send him into cardiac arrest. No need for tea at all." The constable's face darkened. "Then we've arrested the wrong person." Vivian's expression had hardened into something unreadable. "If that's true, then who did it?" Miss Marple's gaze fell once again to the ceramic fox on the desk. Someone had carefully staged the scene to mislead them. Someone had known exactly how Mr. Ransom's condition worked. Someone had gone to great lengths to push suspicion onto Mrs. Felton, and that someone was still in this very room. Miss Marple sat quietly, her fingers lightly clasped as her sharp eyes moved from one face to another. The air in the study was thick with something unspoken, a tension barely restrained beneath the surface. Mrs. Felton had been taken away, but that did not mean the crime was solved. No, far from it. The pieces were coming together, and yet there was something still missing, something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. She glanced again at the ceramic fox. It was small, unassuming, but its placement had struck her as odd from the very beginning. Mr. Ransom's desk was immaculately organized, his papers stacked with a precision that suggested a methodical mind. And yet the fox had been angled just so, as if it had been moved deliberately. Rising from her chair, she stepped toward the desk. The constable watched her curiously, but said nothing as she reached out and gently turned the fox in her hands. It was heavier than expected, the porcelain cool against her skin. Then, with a soft click, the base shifted slightly beneath her fingers. A secret compartment. Miss Marple's lips pursed in satisfaction as she lifted the bottom of the fox, revealing a tightly folded slip of paper. Carefully, she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words written in hurried strokes. "I know the truth. I have proof. Meet me at the old chapel. Midnight." The room had fallen silent, all eyes fixed on her as she read aloud. Vivian's gloved hand clenched slightly. Dr. Haydock's brow furrowed. The constable straightened, stepping forward to take the note. "Old chapel," he muttered. "What chapel?" Dr. Haydock exhaled slowly. "There's only one it could be. St. Oswald's. It was abandoned years ago, just past the village outskirts." Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the paper. Geoffrey Ransom had found something dangerous enough that he sought to arrange a meeting in secret. And yet, he was murdered before he had the chance. The constable glanced at the note again. No signature, no indication of who this was meant for. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "But I rather think we can assume whoever wrote this note was also the intended recipient of that blackmail letter he burned." There was a flicker of reaction, barely perceptible, but Miss Marple saw it nonetheless. Mr. Phelps, the baker, shifted slightly toward the door, as if suddenly eager to leave. She turned her gaze to him. "Tell me, Mr. Phelps, were you acquainted with Geoffrey Ransom beyond your business dealings?" His face, ruddy from years of working over hot ovens, paled slightly. "Acquainted, ma'am?" "No, not particularly. Just a customer like any other." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, but I rather think that isn't quite true." The constable folded his arms. "Is that so, Phelps?" The baker's mouth opened slightly, but before he could speak, it was Vivian Harcourt who cut in. "Really, this is absurd," she said coolly. "A hidden note in a trinket hardly means anything. For all we know, Geoffrey was meeting someone about an article, not a blackmail attempt." Miss Marple turned to her. "Ah, but the wording is quite specific, isn't it? I know the truth." That suggests something already uncovered, something that had been hidden. And given that Mr. Ransom's death followed so closely after, I do not believe it was coincidence. Vivian's lips pressed together, but she did not respond. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Mr. Phelps. "You were seen near Ransom's house the evening before he died, were you not?" He stiffened. I deliver bread every morning, that's all." "Ah, but morning and evening are quite different things, wouldn't you say?" A muscle twitched in his jaw. The constable took a step closer. "Well, Phelps?" Phelps swallowed hard, then let out a breath. "All right," he muttered. "Yes, I was here that night, but not for any crime. Geoffrey asked me to meet him. He said he needed information about the old days." Miss Marple tilted her head. "The old days?" Phelps nodded slowly. "It was a long time ago. Before I took over the bakery, I worked at the old printing house in Much Benham." His voice grew quieter. "And so did Geoffrey." The constable blinked. "Mr. Ransom worked in a printing house?" Phelps gave a bitter chuckle. "Aye, that's where he learned the trade, before he went off to London and made a name for himself. I stayed behind, took over my father's shop." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "And what did he want to know about the past?" Phelps hesitated, then exhaled. He wanted to know about the Chapman case. A hush fell over the room. Dr. Haydock let out a low whistle. "Good Lord." Miss Marple's face remained impassive. "That is a name I haven't heard in some time." The Chapman case, an old scandal that had shaken the village nearly 20 years ago. A man named Albert Chapman, an accountant, had been suspected of embezzling funds from the estate he managed. Before he could be arrested, he vanished without a trace. Some believed he fled abroad. Others whispered that something far darker had happened. The constable frowned. Why on earth would Ransom be investigating that after all these years? Phelps let out a slow breath. "Because he found something. I don't know what, but he said he had proof that Chapman never left the village, that he had been killed." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "And who, pray, did he suspect?" A heavy silence. Phelps's eyes flickered toward Vivian Harcourt. Miss Marple caught it instantly. "Miss Harcourt?" Vivian's face remained a careful mask. "This is nonsense." Phelps shook his head. "I don't think so, ma'am. Your father, Arthur Harcourt. He was Chapman's employer, and Chapman disappeared right after your father was accused of fraud himself." Miss Marple studied Vivian carefully. "A secret buried in the past," she murmured. "One that Mr. Ransom was very close to unearthing." Vivian's fingers tightened against her gloves. Miss Marple's voice was mild, but firm. "You see, my dear, I believe the murder of Geoffrey Ransom was not just about blackmail. It was about silencing a truth that should have come to light long ago." Vivian's expression remained unreadable, but the flicker of something in her eyes, fear perhaps, did not go unnoticed. And Miss Marple knew in that moment that the true motive was far older than anyone had realized. Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the weight of discovery pressing gently upon her. The revelation of the Chapman case had shifted the landscape of the investigation, but it had not yet exposed the murderer. Vivian Harcourt remained an enigma, composed yet guarded, and Mr. Phelps, though seemingly forthcoming, held back more than he admitted. The constable stood by, his eyes darting between the faces in the room, waiting for Miss Marple to make her next move. She exhaled softly. "It is quite fascinating," she said, her voice light, almost conversational. "How the past refuses to stay buried." Vivian's eyes flickered, barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught the movement. Dr. Haydock adjusted his glasses. "Do you truly think Chapman was murdered, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently. "I rather think that is not the real question. The real question is, who would have wanted him dead? And why?" A thick silence followed. Miss Marple rose, moving toward the desk where the ceramic fox had been resting. She picked it up once more, turning it in her hands. "I have always found such objects rather intriguing," she mused. "People often keep small things on their desks. Tokens, gifts, sometimes even souvenirs of past deeds." She let the words settle, then turned the fox over, gliding her fingers across the hidden compartment again. A journalist's desk, however, should hold only the essentials, his tools of trade, his notes, his drafts. And yet Mr. Ransom chose to keep this particular item. Vivian's voice was steady, but a touch too even. "People keep all sorts of things. Sentimental value, perhaps." Miss Marple smiled. "Indeed. But sentimentality is often tied to memory. And memory, my dear, is quite revealing." She set the fox down and turned, addressing the room at large. "I think it is time for an exercise in recollection." The constable frowned. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" She gave a pleasant nod. "A small test of the past." She gestured toward the room. "Everyone here has been involved in some way with Geoffrey Ransom's affairs, and all of you, I dare say, remember precisely where you were the night of his death. But memory is a curious thing. It falters, it bends, and, on occasion, it betrays." She paused, then added, "Let us see if the past will betray someone tonight." Dr. Haydock leaned forward, intrigued. "And how do you propose to do that?" Miss Marple glanced at the constable. "I should like to reconstruct the events, if you don't mind." The constable nodded hesitantly. "If you think it will help." She gestured toward the desk. "Mr. Ransom received the blackmail letter here. We know that. He burned it, but not before reading it carefully." She turned her gaze to Mr. Phelps. "You met him that evening, did you not?" Phelps nodded, his face pale. "Yes. He asked me about Chapman." Miss Marple hummed softly. "And what exactly did you tell him?" Phelps swallowed. "I told him what I knew. That Chapman disappeared after Mr. Harcourt was accused of fraud. That it was all very sudden." "And did he seem surprised?" Phelps hesitated. "No, he seemed determined." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And yet he did not live to pursue that determination, did he?" She turned back to Vivian, studying her closely. "Tell me, my dear, do you recall what you were doing at the time of Mr. Ransom's death?" Vivian's fingers twitched slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "I was at home." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Alone?" Vivian hesitated for the briefest moment. "Yes." The single word hung in the air. Miss Marple's expression softened. "I do wonder if there was ever a moment, even a fleeting one, when you thought Mr. Ransom might expose something better left in the past." Vivian exhaled sharply. "This is absurd. My father had nothing to do with Chapman's disappearance." Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "And yet, Chapman's name was enough to make Mr. Ransom a target." She turned to the constable. "You have the ledger from the printing house, do you not?" The constable blinked. Yes, it's being examined." Miss Marple nodded. "A printing house keeps records of all publications, even those that never go to print. I do wonder if, perhaps, Mr. Ransom had stumbled upon something unpublished, a document meant to be destroyed but kept in the archives by mistake." She turned back to Vivian. "Perhaps something that your father wished never to be seen." Vivian's jaw tightened. "This is all conjecture." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Ah, but conjecture has a way of leading to truth." She stepped forward, her tone soft, almost coaxing. "Tell me, Miss Harcourt, when you heard of Mr. Ransom's death, what was your first thought?" Vivian hesitated, and for the first time her composure wavered. Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You see, I rather think you knew, even before the news reached you, because perhaps in some way you were already waiting for it." A sharp breath, a flicker of something in Vivian's eyes. Fear, guilt, something unspoken. Miss Marple held her gaze. "It is difficult to bear the weight of old sins, my dear, and even harder when they are not our own." Vivian's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken truths. And in that silence, Miss Marple knew. The past had spoken at last. Miss Marple watched the subtle shift in Vivian Harcourt's expression, a moment of hesitation, a fracture in the armor of composure. It was enough to confirm what she already suspected. Vivian knew more than she was willing to say. The past held her in its grip, and if she was not complicit, then she was, at the very least, afraid of what might be revealed. Before Miss Marple could press further, the constable, who had been standing by the door with a rather perplexed expression, straightened abruptly as the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. A moment later, Sergeant Webb appeared, his face flushed with urgency. "Sir," he addressed the constable, glancing quickly at Miss Marple as if to gauge whether she should be privy to the news. Deciding there was no time for formalities, he pressed on. "We have a problem. The ledger, it's gone." A sharp silence fell upon the room. Miss Marple blinked, though she did not look surprised. "Gone?" she repeated mildly. Sergeant Webb nodded. "I left it in the evidence room not half an hour ago, locked away. I returned just now to check something, and the lock had been forced. The ledger is missing." A flicker of something passed over Vivian's face, but she did not speak. The constable swore under his breath. "Who had access?" "Only a handful of people," Webb replied. "Myself, the chief inspector, 2 officers on duty." He hesitated. "And Phelps?" At the mention of his name, Mr. Phelps stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" His voice carried a sharp edge of incredulity. Webb's eyes narrowed. "You asked about the ledger earlier, didn't you? Said you wanted to cross-check something." Phelps' face flushed. "I merely asked if it had arrived. I never even saw it." Miss Marple observed the exchange with interest, her mind carefully turning over the implications. The missing ledger was no coincidence. Someone had taken it to ensure that whatever was inside, whatever had made Geoffrey Ransom a target, was erased before it could be examined too closely. "Tell me," she said, her voice even, "was the ledger in good condition before it was taken?" Webb frowned. "As far as I could tell, a bit old, some pages worn, but intact." Miss Marple nodded, as if she had expected as much. "And forgive me, but was there any other evidence stored alongside it?" Webb hesitated. "A few minor things. Some papers from Ransom's desk, his typewriter ribbon. Nothing that seemed particularly valuable." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. "And yet, someone found it valuable enough to risk stealing it." The constable exhaled sharply. "This means we've got a thief among us. Someone inside the station." Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward Vivian, then to Phelps, then back again. "Or someone who has an accomplice inside." Phelps shook his head vehemently. "This is absurd. I have no reason to take that ledger." "But someone did," Miss Marple said mildly. "And the question, Mr. Phelps, is why?" Silence settled over the room like a thick fog. Miss Marple turned back. To Vivian, her expression gentle but unyielding. "Miss Harcourt, I do believe this concerns you more than anyone else." Vivian's jaw tightened. "I don't know anything about a missing ledger." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but you know what was inside it." Vivian looked away, and Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but insistent. "Geoffrey Ransom found something that connected the past to the present. And now, someone has ensured that we can never see it. Vivian exhaled, a slow, measured breath. I told you, I have nothing to do with this. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver, and yet you are afraid. Vivian's fingers curled against the fabric of her skirt. The room was unbearably still. Then, from the doorway, a voice interrupted. Begging your pardon, sir, an officer called, stepping forward with an expression of mixed urgency and confusion. We've just received a report. There's been a fire at the printing house. Miss Marple turned sharply, and for the first time a genuine look of surprise crossed her face. The constable swore. A fire. The officer nodded. Small but deliberate. Someone broke in. They tried to destroy the archives. Miss Marple's stomach twisted. The ledger was gone, and now the very place where its records might have been duplicated had been set ablaze. Someone was desperate enough to take extreme measures. She turned back to Vivian, her voice quieter now. Miss Harcourt, this is no longer about the past. This is about the present, and if you do not tell me what you know, someone else may pay the price. Vivian's lips parted as if to speak, but then she hesitated. Miss Marple saw it in her eyes. Fear, uncertainty, and something else. A terrible realization. The past was not done with them yet. Miss Marple absorbed the news of the fire with a calmness that belied the quick calculations taking place in her mind. Someone was erasing the past, brick by brick, but such desperation often betrayed a fatal flaw. The perpetrator was rushing, growing reckless. That meant they were close to being caught. Vivian Harcourt sat rigidly in her chair, her face pale and drawn. There was a war within her, that much was clear, but before Miss Marple could press further, a commotion sounded from the hallway. Footsteps, hurried, urgent, then the sharp crack of a door being flung open. Webb turned sharply as another officer stumbled in, breathless. Sir, another incident. We found Phelps. He's... The man swallowed thickly, composing himself. Dead. The room turned cold. The words landed like a stone, their weight settling in the air. Webb straightened. Where? In the alley behind the station. The officer glanced at Miss Marple as if debating whether he should continue in front of her. Strangled, with a typewriter ribbon. For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed Miss Marple's face. A typewriter ribbon. Not just any method. One that sent a message. She cast a glance at Vivian, whose knuckles had gone white where she gripped the armrest of her chair. Phelps was part of this, Miss Marple murmured. Not the architect, but he knew something. Or rather, he had become a liability. Webb exhaled through his nose. So, whoever stole the ledger didn't trust him to keep quiet. Or he had started to doubt them. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, but her mind was moving swiftly. This was not merely an attempt to cover tracks. This was punishment. A warning. Whoever was behind this was no longer merely concealing a crime. They were eliminating those who had served their purpose. Vivian stood abruptly. I need air. Webb made a move to stop her, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. Let her go, Sergeant. She's not running. She's remembering. Vivian's breath was unsteady, but she did not refute it. Instead, she turned and slipped out of the room, leaving behind an air thick with tension. Webb exhaled sharply. This changes everything. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. We are no longer investigating a crime. We are trying to prevent another. Webb hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice low. Do you think she's in danger? Miss Marple's gaze remained on the doorway where Vivian had just disappeared. She was never meant to speak, and yet she has been forced to. Webb stood abruptly. We need to put her under protection. Miss Marple didn't argue. For the first time since the investigation had begun, the pieces were beginning to realign, but the board had changed. The real killer was still ahead, and now they knew they were being hunted, which meant they would strike again. and soon. Miss Marple watched as Vivian Harcourt disappeared down the hallway, her steps hurried but not panicked. It was not the frantic flight of guilt, but rather the urgency of someone piecing together fragments of a past she had tried to forget. Sergeant Webb turned to the constable. "Follow her. Don't let her out of your sight." The officer nodded, striding after her, and Webb exhaled sharply. "This is unraveling faster than I'd like." Miss Marple clasped her hands together, her expression thoughtful. "On the contrary, Sergeant, I do believe things are falling into place." Webb gave her a skeptical glance. "Phelps has just been murdered. The ledger is missing, and someone set fire to the printing house. That doesn't sound like things falling into place." Miss Marple's gaze remained distant, but the glint of understanding had sharpened. "Sergeant, let us consider a curious detail, the method of Phelps' murder." Webb hesitated. "Strangled, with a typewriter ribbon." Miss Marple nodded. "A rather poetic choice, wouldn't you say? A journalist, a man accustomed to ink and print, silenced with the very thing that gave him a voice. That is not coincidence. That is someone sending a message." Webb frowned. "So, you think it wasn't just about getting rid of him?" "Oh, it was certainly about that," Miss Marple agreed. "But it was also about control. The killer is precise, Sergeant. They are making sure that each step they take does not simply erase evidence. It asserts dominance." Webb rubbed a hand down his face. "So what are we missing?" Miss Marple tapped her fingers against the armrest. "A pattern. Every action taken has been purposeful, but one detail stands out as unusual." She paused, allowing Webb to consider before she answered. "The fire," she said softly. "The destruction of the printing house." Webb nodded. "Yes, we assumed it was to destroy records related to the ledger." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Exactly, Sergeant. But why burn an entire archive when only one piece of information is damning?" Webb blinked. "You think something else was the target?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "I think the printing house held more than just records of Geoffrey Ransom's article. It held something that had been overlooked, and our culprit, who has been exceedingly careful, suddenly felt the need to erase everything." Webb straightened. "Then we need to find out what else was in those archives." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed. And we must do so before our elusive criminal realizes that, despite their efforts, they have already left behind their biggest mistake." Webb frowned. "Which is?" Miss Marple smiled, the soft expression carrying the weight of certainty. "That in erasing the past, they have revealed exactly what they were trying to hide." Miss Marple sat perfectly still, her mind sifting through the facts like a patient gardener separating weeds from flowers. The destruction of the printing house was not just a cover-up. It was a desperate erasure of something deeper, something buried long before Geoffrey Ransom's supposed death notice had ever been written. And the methodical nature of the killings, first Ransom, then Phelps, spoke not of random violence but of a personal vendetta, executed with chilling precision. Sergeant Webb paced beside her, his brow furrowed. "We've been looking at this from the wrong angle, haven't we?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Sergeant, we assumed this was about silencing a journalist, about preventing the truth from coming to light. But the destruction of the printing house, the theft of the ledger, and now Phelps' murder, they suggest something far more intimate. Someone is not merely covering their tracks. They are erasing a past that they cannot afford to let resurface." Webb stopped abruptly. "Vivian Harcourt." Miss Marple raised a delicate eyebrow. "You suspect her? She's the common thread, isn't she?" Webb folded his arms. "She worked at the paper. She had access to the records. She was the first to react when the ledger disappeared." Miss Marple's smile was faint, but knowing. "Yes, Sergeant, but do you recall how she reacted? She was frightened." Webb hesitated. "You think she's the next target?" Miss Marple inclined her head. I think, perhaps, she is the key to understanding the motive. The killer is acting with great precision, not because they are concealing a single crime, but because they are protecting a secret that, if revealed, would undo everything. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young constable stepped in, his face tight with urgency. "Sir, we've had a development. Miss Harcourt. She's missing." Webb cursed under his breath. Miss Marple merely sighed as if she had anticipated this all along. "Find out when she was last seen," Webb ordered. "Check the train station, her flat, anywhere she might go." Miss Marple rose carefully from her chair. "Sergeant, I do believe it is time we paid a visit to what remains of the printing house. If we wish to understand the truth, we must look where the killer does not expect us to." The ruins of the printing house still smoldered, a skeletal shell of charred beams and crumbling walls. Webb frowned as they stepped carefully over the debris, their footsteps muffled by layers of soot. If they meant to erase something, they certainly made sure to do it thoroughly, he muttered. Miss Marple crouched near the remnants of an overturned filing cabinet. The fire had consumed most of the paper within, but a few edges remained, browned and curling at the tips. She reached out, brushing a delicate hand over a half-burned scrap of parchment. Her eyes sharpened. "Sergeant," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I do believe we have found what our killer was so desperate to destroy." Webb crouched beside her, frowning as he examined the scorched paper. A few letters remained visible, ghostly outlines against the charred remains. A name and a date. Webb read it, his breath catching. Good Lord. He turned to Miss Marple. "That's nearly 30 years ago." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, and I rather think our true motive lies buried there." Webb exhaled sharply. "So this isn't about Ransom's article at all. This is about something that happened long before." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Not just something, Sergeant. Someone." A silence stretched between them, and in that silence, the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Miss Marple held the charred scrap of paper delicately between her fingers, the ink barely visible through the scorched edges. The name had been mostly burned away, but enough remained to confirm her suspicions. 30 years ago. The truth had been buried under layers of deception, and now the murderer was doing everything possible to keep it that way. But it was too late. Sergeant Webb, still staring at the date on the fragment, exhaled sharply. "This has never been about Geoffrey Ransom's death notice, has it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Sergeant. That was merely a spark to reignite an old fire. The real crime began long before this." Webb's jaw tightened. "Then it's time we bring them out into the open." Miss Marple's voice was calm, assured. "Yes, Sergeant, and I do believe I know just how to do it." The drawing room of the Harcourt residence was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the outside world. The atmosphere inside was thick with anticipation, the kind that only comes before the final act of a carefully staged play. Miss Marple sat comfortably in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, while Sergeant Webb stood by the fireplace, his presence a silent but unmistakable force. The room's sole guest fidgeted, eyes darting between them, trying to determine whether this was merely another round of questions or something more. "You requested to speak with me privately, Miss Marple." The voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of wariness beneath it. "May I ask why?" Miss Marple smiled, a grandmotherly expression that, despite its warmth, had a sharpness to it. "Oh, my dear, I thought it only proper. After all, we have reached a most critical moment in this unfortunate affair, and I would so hate to see unnecessary distress." The figure shifted in their chair. "I see. Then I assume you have solved the mystery." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed. And what a tangled web it has been, wouldn't you agree?" There was no answer. The fire crackled in the silence. Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle. It was never about Ransom's article, nor even about the missing ledger. No, the true crime, the one that started all of this, took place decades ago, didn't it? Still no answer. But the tension in the air thickened. Miss Marple sighed softly. It was rather ingenious, I must admit, burying the past so thoroughly that even those who searched for it found nothing but ashes. And yet, one cannot erase everything, can they? A flicker of something, annoyance, fear, crossed the listener's face. Sergeant Webb finally spoke, his voice firm. The fire at the printing house, the murder of Jeffrey Ransom, the death of James Phelps, they were all desperate acts to hide one thing, a name. Miss Marple leaned forward ever so slightly. Not the name of a journalist or a corrupt official, but the name of a child. The silence now was absolute. Miss Marple's voice softened. 30 years ago, a child disappeared. Officially, it was recorded as a tragedy, a drowning, a loss. But it was not so, was it? A sharp intake of breath. Miss Marple's eyes did not waver. The child did not die. The child was hidden, given a new life, a new name. The figure before her trembled slightly but did not speak. Sergeant Webb stepped forward. Vivian Harcourt was that child. The words landed like a hammer. The accused swallowed hard, hands clenching in their lap. This is absurd. Miss Marple shook her head. Oh no, my dear. Not absurd. Quite tragic, actually. You see, Vivian never knew. She lived her life unaware of the past, buried beneath her very name. But someone knew the truth. And when Jeffrey Ransom's article came too close, when Phelps uncovered records that should have remained hidden, well, you had to act, didn't you? A cold laugh. And what exactly do you think I did, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled, and it was that very smile, kind, knowing, patient, that shattered the last defense. You killed them. The words hung in the air. You killed Jeffrey Ransom because his investigation came too close to revealing the truth. You killed Phelps because he had the records that would have exposed it. And you burned the printing house to make sure no trace of that past remained. Sergeant Webb took another step forward. And then, when Vivian herself became a threat, when she started piecing things together, you tried to silence her too. At last, the mask cracked. I had no choice. The words burst forth, filled with a rage that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. You don't understand. If the truth had come out, if she had known, everything would have unraveled. The life I built, the sacrifices I made, they would have meant nothing. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but firm. The past cannot be erased, my dear. No matter how hard one tries, it has a way of resurfacing. The murderer exhaled shakily, their shoulders slumping. And what now? Sergeant Webb placed a firm hand on their shoulder. Now, the past will finally come to light. The room was silent once more, but this time it was the silence of resolution. The truth had been spoken, the case was closed, and justice, as it always did in the end, had found its way through the darkness. Miss Marple observed the defeated figure slumped in the chair. The confession had been extracted, the truth laid bare. Sergeant Webb had already signaled for his men, and soon enough the room would be swarming with officers ready to make an arrest. And yet something still gnawed at her. It was a subtle sensation, the kind that only a lifetime of keen observation could cultivate, a whisper at the edge of certainty, a thread still untied. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the silence with its quiet pops and sighs. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the window, the darkness outside seeming almost impenetrable. The world had settled, the mystery unraveled, or so it seemed. A sharp knock at the door made everyone start. Sergeant Webb turned abruptly, frowning. "That must be my men," he muttered. But Miss Marple was already rising, an unfamiliar urgency propelling her forward. "No, Sergeant," she murmured. I believe that is someone else." The knock came again. Firm, insistent. Webb hesitated before moving toward the door. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Every movement, every breath, as he turned the handle and pulled the door open. A man stood in the threshold, his coat damp from the evening mist, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He stepped forward, the dim glow of the fire illuminating his face. Geoffrey Ransom. A collective gasp filled the room. The man who had been declared dead, whose own death notice had sent this entire affair spiraling into chaos, was very much alive. His gaze swept across the room before settling on the murderer, who was now frozen in place, mouth slightly open in horror. "Surprised to see me?" Ransom's voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a quiet accusation. Miss Marple exhaled softly. I thought as much." Webb, still recovering from the shock, stepped forward. You're supposed to be dead?" Ransom finished for him, a mirthless smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, well, it turns out I wasn't quite ready for the obituary section just yet." Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. "Would you be so kind as to explain?" Ransom nodded, removing his hat and settling into a chair with an air of exhaustion. "I knew someone was after me the moment I started asking questions about the Harcourt family history. I'd gathered enough evidence to suspect that the fire at the printing house was no accident, that it was meant to destroy a set of records linking someone to a decades-old crime. But before I could publish my findings, I received a warning. A very specific one." His eyes flicked toward the murderer. "And so, I decided to take myself off the board before someone else could." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "A preemptive disappearance. Quite clever, Mr. Ransom, though I imagine it was not easy." Ransom exhaled a dry chuckle. "Not in the slightest. Faking your own death is considerably more difficult than the novels suggest." Webb's gaze hardened. "But why reveal yourself now?" Ransom's expression darkened. "Because I realized that in hiding, I had left others to suffer the consequences. Phelps was killed because of what he knew. The moment I heard of his death, I knew I had miscalculated. And then there was the attempt on Vivian Harcourt." His jaw tightened. "I could not stay in the shadows any longer." The murderer, whose name had already been blackened by confession, shook their head in disbelief. "No, this isn't possible. You were supposed to be." Ransom leaned forward. "Dead. Yes, you certainly tried to ensure that, didn't you? But I was one step ahead." Miss Marple observed the way the murderer's fingers twitched, how their shoulders had become rigid with barely contained rage. The sudden reappearance of a supposed corpse had rattled them beyond words. It was a fascinating display. Then she turned her attention back to Ransom. "There is something still unsettled, Mr. Ransom." He frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple tapped a finger against the armrest of her chair. "Your information was valuable, of course, but I do not believe it was enough to justify such desperate actions from our murderer." The room fell into silence. Webb frowned. "But we already have a confession. We know why they did it." Miss Marple's smile was patient. "Do we, Sergeant, or do we only know what we were meant to believe?" She turned her gaze back to the murderer, who had begun to shift uneasily in their seat. "You confessed," Miss Marple continued. "Yes, but you confessed to the wrong crime." The murderer stiffened. Ransom's brow furrowed. "I don't follow." Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "Your death notice was not published to lure you out of hiding, Mr. Ransom. It was meant to confirm that you were truly gone. You were not the intended victim." Webb's face darkened. "Then who was?" Miss Marple exhaled softly. "Vivian Harcourt." A stunned silence settled over the room. "She was the last loose thread," Miss Marple explained, "the only one who might have unknowingly stumbled upon the truth of her own origins. When Geoffrey Ransom vanished, our murderer panicked. If you were alive, Mr. Ransom, you could still uncover everything. But if you were dead, then the only other person who mattered was Vivian. Ransom's eyes widened as realization struck. That's why they tried to kill her. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. The murderer, now pale as a ghost, let out a slow, shuddering breath. You can't prove anything. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. Can't I? She turned to Ransom. Tell me, Mr. Ransom, before you faked your death, where did you hide your evidence? Ransom hesitated, then reached into his coat, pulling out a small, folded bundle of papers. Here, he murmured. Miss Marple took the papers gently, unfolding them with great care. Her eyes skimmed over the words, taking in every name, every date. Then at last, she looked up. Well then, she said with a smile, I do believe this is checkmate. The murderer closed their eyes, their face twisting into something hollow and defeated. The room remained silent, save for the distant wail of approaching sirens. Justice, as always, had the final word. Miss Marple folded the papers carefully, setting them on the table as the sound of approaching sirens grew louder. The room was thick with tension, the weight of revelation pressing down on everyone within its walls. The murderer, exposed, defeated, sat motionless, their gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Sergeant Webb stepped forward, his voice firm but measured. It's over. You know that. The murderer let out a slow breath, then turned toward Miss Marple, studying her with something that resembled reluctant admiration. You really are remarkable, they murmured. You see everything. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but there was no warmth in it. It was never about seeing, she said. It was about listening. People will always tell you the truth if you give them enough time, even when they think they're lying. The murderer's expression darkened. And what exactly did I say that gave me away? Miss Marple considered them for a moment, then spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had already won. You spoke of Ransom's death with too much certainty. You were the only one who never questioned it. Even those who saw the body harbored doubts, yet you did not hesitate. That was the first thread. Ransom leaned forward, a frown pulling at his brow. But that could have been a mistake. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, which is why I waited. But then there was Vivian. Her gaze returned to the murderer. You positioned yourself near her at every turn, appearing concerned, protective even, but true concern does not waver. When she was attacked, you hesitated, just for a moment. That was the second thread. Webb exhaled sharply. And the third? Miss Marple's expression softened. You made one crucial miscalculation. You assumed that your confession would close the case, that we would stop looking. But you see, I've always believed that a murderer confesses only when they think they can still control the outcome. The murderer's lips parted, but no words came. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. You wanted us to believe this was about silencing Ransom, about protecting some long-buried secret, but the true motive was fear. Not fear of exposure, but fear of the past. Vivian Harcourt was never meant to live long enough to learn the truth of her own existence. Silence fell over the room, the finality of her words settling into every corner. Then came the voices outside, the heavy footsteps, the sharp commands. The door swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Webb turned to them, nodding once. Take them in. The murderer rose slowly, their movements unhurried, as if savoring these last moments of freedom. As the officers reached for their arms, they exhaled a quiet laugh. You know, they mused, I almost admire you, Miss Marple. She met their gaze, steady and unwavering. That will have to be enough, I'm afraid. The murderer gave one last small smile before allowing themselves to be led away. The tension in the room seemed to break as soon as they were gone. Webb let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. Well, that's that then. Ransom, still appearing somewhat dazed by the night's events, shook his head. "I can hardly believe it." Miss Marple offered him a reassuring smile. "The truth is often difficult to accept, but it is always there, waiting to be seen." Ransom nodded slowly. "And Vivian, she'll be safe now." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "I do believe she will be." Outside, the sirens faded into the distance. Justice had been served, or at the very least, it had caught up. And yet, as Miss Marple stared into the flickering fire, she could not shake the feeling that the story was not entirely over. There were always shadows that stretched beyond the light, secrets that refused to remain buried. She only hoped that this time they had uncovered enough. As the embers in the fireplace dimmed, casting elongated shadows across the parlor, Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. The case had been neatly tied up, at least in the eyes of the law. The murderer had been taken into custody, their confession leaving little room for doubt. Vivian was safe, Ransom vindicated, and the village of St. Mary Mead would soon return to its usual rhythm of gossip and tea. And yet something lingered, a whisper of unfinished business. Sergeant Webb noticed the way Miss Marple's gaze remained distant, her thoughts still moving beneath the surface. He cleared his throat. "I should be relieved," he admitted, "and I am, of course. But something tells me you're not entirely at ease." Miss Marple turned her sharp blue eyes toward him, offering a mild smile. "A detective is never truly at ease, Sergeant. There is always another thread left unpulled." Webb frowned. "What thread?" She hesitated. "The simplest of all, really. The confession came too soon, too willingly. Our culprit was meticulous in planning every detail. Why, then, collapse under pressure so quickly?" Ransom, who had been listening quietly, suddenly tensed. "You think they wanted to be caught?" Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "It is an unsettling thought, isn't it? But I cannot help but feel that we were meant to solve this." Vivian, still pale from her ordeal, glanced up from where she sat. "But why? If they hadn't confessed, would you have found conclusive evidence?" Miss Marple tapped a delicate finger against the armrest. "In time, yes. But confessions are often final acts of control. And control was what this entire crime was about, was it not?" Webb exhaled through his nose. "You're suggesting we were manipulated?" "Not manipulated, Sergeant. Directed." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ransom shifted uncomfortably. "Then who was really behind it?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh, I believe our culprit is precisely who they claimed to be. But they were not the only player in this game." Silence. The fire crackled softly. Vivian swallowed hard. "So, you're saying someone else was involved? Someone we didn't catch?" Miss Marple rose to her feet, smoothing out her skirt. "Perhaps not involved in the crime itself, but certainly invested in its outcome. And if that is the case, my dear, then I suspect we have not seen the last of this mystery." Webb rubbed a hand over his face. "Do you think we missed something?" Miss Marple smiled, but it was a smile tinged with something unreadable. "No, Sergeant. I think we found exactly what we were supposed to." The thought was an unsettling one, and even as the room began to empty, Webb departing to file his report, Ransom leading Vivian to rest, Miss Marple remained by the fire, watching the flickering flames as if searching for answers in their restless dance. Then, just as the last embers began to fade, a small, nearly imperceptible sound reached her ears. A soft rustling, as though a note had been slipped beneath the door. She turned slowly, bending down to pick up the single sheet of paper resting on the carpet. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink fresh. A single line. "Not everything buried stays buried, Miss Marple." She read the words twice, a chill settling deep in her bones. Then, tucking the note carefully into her pocket, she straightened, smoothing down her dress. The case was closed, But the mystery was far from over.